Well, first up, US President Barack Obama has vowed to degrade and ultimately destroy Islamic State militants who control large parts of Iraq and Syria. In a prime-time address, he described IS as a terrorist group, unique in its brutality. Well, President Obama stressed he won't send American troops to fight on the ground and that he'll act in coalition with Western allies as well as Arab states.
Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. It will take time to eradicate a cancer like ISIL. And any time we take military action, there are risks involved, especially to the servicemen and women who carry out these missions. But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil.
President Obama addressing the nation, indeed addressing the globe earlier today, our time. Caroline Overington, what did you make of the President's address? What was its point?
Well, I guess I would say it was somewhat cautious. You know, we've seen already these thugs, these enforcers slaughtering American citizens and in fact declaring war, if you like, directly addressing President Obama in their YouTube addresses, and his response has been to say that we will not go to war. I think that's an interesting position for a US president to take. He is extremely cautious, particularly when compared with leaders past.
Paul Sheehan, that word that Caroline has used there in regard to how he spoke and what he said, cautious.
Every reason to be cautious. What a horrible hellhole of a foreign policy dilemma he's in. But I am struck by the striking statement he made at the outset of his speech, which was for the domestic audience, which is why half the speech was praise about America's leadership in the world, was that ISIL is not Islamic. Well, I mean, if you talk to the ISIL men about why they're doing it, they will give you chapter and verse of the Quran. It is their MO to cite the Quran for all their barbarity. And so ISIS itself is out of the Sunni schism with the Shia. So, and the failed state in Iraq and the failed state in Syria. It's all about Islam. It's just that these people are psychopaths who are quoting Islam, which puts him in a very difficult position because he needs Saudi Arabia, that terrorist state that is our ally, and he needs the Arabs to step up. Why do we have to be the ones always that are doing the shooting and the killing when things get out of hand? Why can't the Saudi military and the Iranians just face off one another on the battlefield? Why is it us stuck in the middle?
James Jeffrey, why is it us?
Well, I think that's a good question, because we've heard a lot about how a lot of the neighbours are completely appalled by what's going on. So maybe the Saudis could take a break from beheading, which they do with great enthusiasm, and get in there themselves. But I think, apart from everything else, I think Obama's being tremendously optimistic. I don't know, when has a campaign purely using airstrikes ever worked?
So you think boots on the ground is going to be an inevitability?
Oh, it has to be. It has to be.
And that's somewhat cheeky of you, Mr. Sheehan, because it is not about Islam as practiced by the vast majority of people who follow that faith.
Well, I would say,
as you would know, and as to why we need to be involved, they're killing us. They're killing Americans. They're killing people who are part of the Western coalition. We're already involved, whether we like it or not.
Let's bring in Tom Switzer here for a closer look at President Barack Obama's speech. Now, Tom is a research associate at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Centre. The debate has started here in Sydney, Tom. You're in Brisbane. What was your reading of the speech? What did you take from it?
I think all of the panellists are broadly right. It was a cautious speech. No ground troops, no grand declarations about exporting democracy to this arbitrarily created state. And the President, you have to remember, is talking to a war-weary nation. They are tired of the world, the Americans. They're suffering from foreign policy fatigue. And although something like 70% of Americans support airstrikes against ISIS or IS, they don't have the attention span or staying power to do what President George W. Bush tried to do in 2003, which was remake and transform this country. My only concern with the remarks was if one's serious about eradicating this evil and not merely trying to be virtuous and righteous, you have to recognise that ground troops will be inevitable to fight the Sunni insurgents, to bribe certain tribal leaders in the Sunni heartland. And moreover, what's missing here is a key political consensus. All the available evidence, Scott, since 2003 shows that the Sunni, who had been running the show in Iraq for generations, who are now the political losers, don't want to reconcile with the Shia. And the Shia, whether it's Maliki or his successor, are more likely to be seeking revenge against their former tormentors rather than building a nation. There are no Nelson Mandelas in Iraq today, and I think ultimately that is why this mission will fail.
You've made the point today on the Drum website that you feel that all the leaders, or a number of the world leaders, including the US president, just hasn't taken into account this Sunni-Shia divide.
Look, I think this is the big story that's taking place in not just Iraq, but through the broader region, this Sunni-Shia divide. And ultimately, this is coming down to two major powers. Saudi Arabia, a long-time US Sunni ally in the region, versus Iran, a Shia power that is bent on asserting a sphere of influence in the region. So I think this is ultimately the main game, and I think that James and Caroline and Paul are broadly right. This is ultimately going to have to be a regional remedy. Now, the Americans can play some kind of role with airstrikes, but ultimately this is a battle for the Kurds in the north, the Shia in the south, the Turkish government, and of course, who would have thought Assad's Syria, the very country that we were on the cusp of toppling a year ago. So this is morally ambiguous, and I think ultimately that is why the President has been cautious today.
And Tom, Paul made the point a moment ago that at the top bit of the address at least was addressing a domestic audience. The President said to that audience, as Commander-in-Chief, his highest priority is the security of the American people. But as a politician who promised to pull US troops out of this region, out of Iraq, how much is his highest priority as a politician to deal with the patience of the American people?
Well, look, as I said before, Scott, I just think all the public opinion polling evidence shows that the Americans are tired of the world. Just a month or so ago, we had polls showing that a majority of Americans, 53%, want the United States to mind its own business internationally. They are, as a former president put it in the 1820s, no mood to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Now, they're easily aroused because they've seen these YouTube images, which are very disturbing, and I think most people in their right mind wants to eradicate these terrorists, or as the Vice President says, follow them to the gates of hell where they will be brought to justice. But ultimately, this is going to be a very complicated process, and it's fraught with the danger of unintended consequences.
Sure.
The war on terror, that phrase, those three words, has got to be one of those stupid aphorisms ever given by a leader of a major state. Because a war, that's the wrong word to use. Terror is the wrong word to use. You're battling smoke forevermore. We are dealing with an ideology. I think that ISIL and Islamic State is probably a bit overblown because they've gone into a vacuum. They've gone into two failed states. They haven't yet confronted serious military opposition, but we're seeing the breakup of Iraq. The inevitable breakup of Iraq. Kurdistan will have to emerge out of this as a bulwark against that. And as Tom pointed out, the Sunnis and the Shia, forget about it. It's all over in Iraq. And then the question is, what about us? What are we going to do?
Yeah. Well, that is the big question, Tom. What are we going to do as part of this international coalition?
Well, the Australian government of Tony Abbott, and I think it's a broadly bipartisan position, will support the President's attempts to degrade and destroy this network. And I think all things considered, they'll commit Super Hornets and maybe even SAS troops, intelligence. But I want to get back to a key point that Paul alluded to. This is really the heart of the matter. As unfashionable as it is to say, the fact of the matter is that many people in the Sunni heartland, in those towns like Mosul, Fallujah, Tikrit, Ramallah, that all fell to ISIS during the course of the last few months. The fact of the matter is the broad cross-section of those Sunni people are more afraid of the Shia-led government in Baghdad that is bent on revenge than they are by these Sunni militia. And by the way, it's a disparate group of Sunni militia we're talking about in Iraq. It's not just ISIS. There are other tribal groups There are other jihadist groups. And according to Jessica Matthews from the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, one of Washington's leading foreign policy thinkers, her argument is that many of these jihadi groups actually dislike each other. Some of them even hate each other, and they're bound to disagree and fight, but they're more likely to unite in the wake of a massive, intensive US bombing campaign. In other words, one of the unintended consequences of this military strike campaign, Scott, I think, and I fear, is that it might reaffirm that potent Sunni narrative that Washington tolerates and facilitates the violent Shia offensive that they've been experiencing since 2003.
Caroline, that labyrinthine conflict, that complex conflict that Thomas just outlined there, how do you think the Australian people would feel if we sent our troops back in to be part of this coalition?
We don't have any choice. If we're asked to go, as sure as night follows day, we will go. And I think that Tony Abbott was making that clear today, that when asked, or if asked, the likelihood is that we will provide all the support necessary.
But how do you think the people will feel about that?
We have to, and I think that the Australian public understands that the alliance is important. And if, when asked, you don't respond, then there is no point having an alliance at all.
James?
I suspect the support's not going to be unanimous, though, when it comes. Of course we'll go. We don't say no, do we?
We can't say no.
America. But what I want to ask Tom is, do we run the risk of, do we keep going into place, when I say we, I'm speaking the sort of broadly of the Western coalition, do we keep going into places and creating new vacuums into which new and more hideous sort of forces rise up?
Well, I said this on Lateline the other night. A year ago exactly, Prime Minister David Cameron and President Obama tried to seek legislative authority to use military strikes to bring down the Assad regime in Syria. And both the Commons and the Congress did not, or were not going to give the President and the Prime Minister that authority. Now, thank goodness for that, James, because the demise of Assad a year ago would have merely created a vacuum for the very terrorist groups we're talking about here. Look, this is morally ambiguous stuff, and you're quite right to be sceptical.
Well, Tom, you should have said it first here on the drum, not Lateline, but we forgive you.
You're fun.
And by the way, you can head over to the Drum website for more on the conflict in Iraq. The former DFAT staffer Tim Mayfield says the Kurds could have some big demands in return for their help against Islamic State.